Journalist Daniel Libet is a native New Mexican now based in Chicago who has worked for Politico and many other publications, including the National Journal, where he recently did an in-depth piece on the man who helped get Governor Susana Martinez elected, Jay McCleskey. Libet's article has created a lot of interest here and even sparked a call by Democrats for an IRS investigation. I sat down with him to talk about why he wanted to write about Martinez and how the article evolved to focus on McCleskey. Daniel Libet, thanks for coming to see us for a few minutes to talk about your article. Quick first question. What was the driving force behind the article in the first place? Why were you interested in the Martinez administration?
Well, I saw in Governor Martinez a rising star figure nationally who's had already received some national treatment, mainly focused on her very compelling personal biography. And what I thought wasn't being addressed in the national media as much was what really led to her being elected and what was really going on in her first term. And there was her supporters were obviously very supportive of her. There was some controversy, so I thought I'd dig into it. So in August, I went to Santa Fe. I met with her in her office. I interviewed her for about 45 minutes, and thought I was going to do a fairly straightforward profile on her in her first term. As my reporting progressed, it became very clear to me from my sources that the story about Susana Martinez really was a story about her relationship with her political advisor and his influence and his role in her decisions, perhaps, in her politics, in helping get her elected, and as we look forward to 2014, in helping get her reelected.
Sure. I mean, clearly you went in with a game plan. There's always that moment when a source kind of spins you in another direction. Was there a particular moment where you realized the story, in fact, was taking a turn for you? Was there a very particular conversation where you realized, okay, maybe there's something else going on here?
It was just the totality. I mean, my reporting really migrated off of the governor specifically and focused on Jay, because I was hearing from so many people who had been a part of their operation, who had been part of the first campaign, who were closely related to it, and his name was the one that kept coming up. In fact, often the times more than her name was coming up.
Interesting. And there's always that moment where you realize you have to chase this down in another way, but then you have to get some people to talk about it on the record. And as a reporter, that's a huge challenge, and especially, I'm assuming in this case, perhaps a lot of those folks were not willing to go on the record. How did you work through that? You have some people on the record, but a whole lot that weren't. What was the balancing act?
Yeah, this is obviously the challenge for doing any story about a politician or a public figure, is getting people who have an inside perspective to talk candidly without feeling that they're at professional risk or simply that they don't want to cross somebody who they like. So this was a process, as it is. I spent the better part of 3 months working on sources. Most of the conversations I had with people were off the record.
Right.
Some of them I was able to get on the condition that I not identify who they were, and some folks, finally after a period of time and many conversations and back and forth, were willing to give me their name to put behind what they were saying, what they were claiming.
Was there a commonality that you started to hear? Was there a common thread in what folks were saying about either Ms. Martinez or Jay McCleskey that you gleaned?
Yeah, the prevailing argument was that Jay had, by their lights, too much control. Now that could be interpreted in various different ways depending on who I spoke to. Some people allege that he had too much control in the actual decisions of state government, even though he is a hired person outside of the state government. And they thought that there should be a brighter, more defined line between his role as the governor's political advisor and what would be the role of a chief of staff, who she has somebody who is her chief of staff who's not Jay McCleskey. There was concerns about his control over campaign money associated with Governor Martinez, and whether or not, because there wasn't other oversight and other people involved, that the way that money was being managed was in the most transparent and correct way. And just generally then this idea that we want to know, in terms of our public servants, how they're making up their minds. Sure. And that because of his presence, there was questions and concerns and uncertainty about who was informing the governor, who was her sounding board, And was this process, this kind of intellectual process that was going on within state government, completely transparent?
If you talk to Jay, and I'm sure he expressed this to you, he believes in the governor's mission, believes in this governor and what she's trying to do for our state, and that's fair enough. But I'm curious again, from your point of view, what was about Jay McCleskey that you were so fascinated with?
Jay McCleskey is an interesting figure to me, and more interesting than other political advisors of potential national Republican figures or national figures, just because of the psychic hold he seems to have on the political community in New Mexico. The appellation that's been attached to him is that he is the Karl Rove of New Mexico. Now, Jay and others supportive of the governor push back against this notion that he's anything different than what you'd find with anybody else. And I would push back against that. I don't think that this is necessarily the role of political advisor that you would find with every other governor or senator or whatnot. And again, everybody talks about him, and there's a perception that if you want to get stuff done, you need to go through Jay McCleskey in New Mexico. He has, there's this line about him occupying the 5th floor of the 4-story roundhouse. And so again, this is very much like what people had said about Karl Rove, George W. Bush's political advisor, which is why that's the nickname that he's been given.
Sure. You also use the word, I found this very interesting, consigliere. And that is a loaded word, depending on the part of the country you're in, I suppose. But it denotes something that there's a certain kind of a power that's almost dark, in a way. What do you think of the classic consigliere in a mafia
right.
context?
So that appeared. That was not my words. That was an editor's headline was the word consigliere. So I will not take responsibility for that.
Fair enough.
I will say that there's questions. I mean, Jay makes the argument that he's outside of the government. And unlike Bill Richardson, who hired a lot of people inside of the government and then created a lot of scrutiny based on that, Jay stayed outside of the government and said, well, that to him, or by his lights, means he's more on the up and up about things.
Right.
Other people just wonder, again, if a lot of the stuff that he's doing is the stuff of a traditional chief of staff.
And that gets to the transparency issue a lot of folks have problems with.
And remember, Governor Martinez ran in 2010 as the transparency governor. This was a big thing. It'll be interesting to see now, as there's all these claims against how transparent she is, how much of a campaign issue she makes this year, or whether or not this is now converted as an attack against her. I'll say this: when I was in Santa Fe in late August and interviewing her, I asked her about the question. I asked her how she would rate herself in terms of open government and transparency, and she gave me kind of a wishy-washy answer of, well, that's, it's not for me to say, it's for others to decide. That was the same governor who really made a strong case about how transparent she would be. So again, I don't know how much stock one should put in one conversation she had with me, but it would be interesting to see how much she makes transparency an issue in terms of her assets going into 2014.
That's a good point. Another interesting part of your piece is the Downs, the racetrack that was under no small controversy about how it all came to be. Some of the players, there's been a lot of confusion in the local market about who supported it, who didn't. Who in the administration was influential in this? What was your sense of the Downs particularly, and where do you think the FBI sort of fits into all this? Because that's another point of, not contention, but mystery. Are they involved? Are they looking? Are they not looking? That's a real mystery for us here.
Well, the FBI doesn't comment, as is standard practice, on ongoing investigations. There's been a couple of people who have come forward over the last year or so and said that they have been interviewed by the FBI, either about the Downs. Andrea Goff told me on the record that she had been interviewed by the FBI earlier this year about McCleskey and about the different sorts of political organizations that he oversees related to the governor. Now, what does that mean? That can mean a whole host of things, and it's important for your viewers to understand the difference between even the specter of an FBI investigation and something much broader or more damning, like a grand jury being convened or somebody being indicted. That hasn't happened. What has happened is there's been some claims of folks like Andrea who have said that they've been interviewed by the FBI. In terms of the Downs deal is unclear and it is rather murky, and I don't have all the pieces in place. What I reported in my story was what Andrea Goffe told me, that in late 2011, when the bid to determine who was going to get this Racino lease, this 25-year, very lucrative Racino lease, was being decided on by the State Fair Board. Her father-in-law, a dairy farmer named Buster Goffe, sits on that board. She told me an anecdote about a text message back exchange with Jay McCleskey, in which McCleskey was trying to, by her lights, express how disappointed he was and the governor was that Buster Goffe wasn't signing up for this deal during a particular vote. As it so happened, 2 weeks later, Buster Goffe had come around and the deal got passed and the bid was given to the Albuquerque Downs. But her concern, and this was one of the reasons why she left her post as a fundraiser for the governor and for the governor's political action committee, Susanna PAC, was she felt that she was being pressured by Jay McCleskey over these text messages, that he was trying to have her sway her father-in-law, Buster Goffe, who sat on this board, to cast a certain kind of vote. This was her impression from these text messages. I lay out, I think, in pretty detailed fashion, the back and forth in the exchange in the article. Jay told me and pushed back against this, said this is not what was happening. Say he had every right. He didn't dispute that he had sent these text messages or that the text message conversations took place. But he said that this was all on the up and up, and he was acting in the appropriate role as one of the governor's political advisor.
Sure. Have you heard from Jay McCleskey since the piece has come out?
I heard after the piece, in the days after the piece, from Jay.
What was the sense of that conversation? What was?
These were over email that I had gotten.
Gotcha.
He had, after the piece came out, he had some bones to pick about some of the things, some of the facts in the story. My editors at National Journal and I spent a lot of time with him in the week before the piece, going through almost chronologically some of the different claims we had made. We felt very confident. I felt very confident that we gave them a full chance to tell their side. Ultimately, when he brought up some of his other contentions, I wasn't swayed that we had gotten anything wrong. The only thing that I think we amended in the story was an interview that the governor had given to Latina Magazine shortly after she was elected. They disputed a word that I used to characterize that interview, and basically her how familiar she was with certain aspects of federal immigration policy.
Right.
But in terms of the substantive aspects of the story, I felt we gave them a fair airing. I've seen in subsequent media reports have pushed back against the article, which is certainly they're entitled to do, and push back against some of the claims that my sources were making.
Sure. We've invited Jay to come on and talk about this. He's declined, but it's a standing invite, so perhaps he'll take some time to come sit with us at some point about it. In sum, we're going to wrap up here just under a minute to go. Oftentimes in in-depth reporting, there's a lot of stuff you're kind of like, I wish I could get to that. There's so much more here in other angles. Are you inclined to come back and take another cut at this story in some other ways?
I don't know if I'm, in short term, no. I mean, I still have a lot in my notebook that I wasn't able to get in the story because it wasn't germane necessarily to the focus of Jay McCleskey and Governor Martinez and this first term. But yeah, I've heard from people after the article trying to bring me new piece of information.
That happens. Yeah.
Right. And there's certainly more to be reported.
Yeah.
This is a long campaign for her reelection. I'm sure there's going to be other reporting done by other outlets, as there should be, because she's the most important person in the state in terms of the government. I should mention that you asked me before about the FBI investigation.
Quickly, if you could.
Yes, I did hear after the article came out, Andre Goff told me that she had been contacted again by the FBI about, she wouldn't specifically tell me what that conversation entailed, but it was about the general nature of the things that she had previously spoken to them about. Again, so I don't know where that places it. It seems to suggest at least that there's some activity, if what she told me was accurate, that there continues to be some activity. I know Democrats are trying to dredge up some more stuff there.
Sure.
So we'll wait to see.
There you go. Daniel Libet, thank you for spending some time with us.
My pleasure.
Come see us again.
Take care.